Hi everyone, I'm Sarah. 3 weeks ago, I stood in the kitchen of what my family calls the ancestral home, while my mother looked me dead in the eye and said, "Sarah, sweetie, this house is for real family only. Maybe it's time you found your own place." She said it with that particular smile she reserves for when she thinks she's being gracious while delivering a devastating blow. What she didn't know was that I'd closed on the property exactly 32 days earlier. That house she was kicking me out of? I owned every single brick, every creaking floorboard, every rosebush in the front garden that I'd been tending for the past 3 years. You see, my mother Linda had been living in a fantasy where my older brother Jake was destined to inherit our grandfather's old farmhouse, the one that sits on 5 gorgeous acres in Millbrook, Ohio. She'd spent years talking about how Jake would raise his children there, how he'd carry on the family traditions, how it was practically written in the stars. The only problem was that the bank had foreclosed on that house 6 months ago, and Linda had been pretending it never happened. She'd been letting me pour thousands of dollars into repairs and maintenance while planning to gift my brother a property she no longer owned. But here's the thing about being underestimated your whole life. People stop paying attention to what you're actually capable of. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me start from the beginning, because the roots of this story go back to when I was 12 years old, and we moved away from Grandpa's farm. That's when the hierarchy in my family became crystal clear. Jake was 15 then, old enough to drive the tractor and help with the heavier farm work during summers. I was just the little sister who collected eggs and helped Grandma in the vegetable garden. Even at 12, I could see how differently my mother's eyes lit up when she watched Jake operating machinery versus when she saw me carefully tending to the tomato plants. When we moved to town so Mom could take a better-paying job at the insurance office, Jake got to stay involved with the farm operations. Every weekend, every school break, he'd drive back out to help Grandpa with whatever needed doing. I asked to come along countless times, but there was always some reason why it wasn't practical. The work was too physical. I'd get in the way. I was needed at home to help with laundry or meal prep. By the time I turned 16 and could drive myself out there, the pattern was already set. Jake was Grandpa's right hand, destined to take over someday. I was just the granddaughter who visited. My mother Linda has always had this way of speaking about the future like it was already decided by forces beyond our control. "Jake will probably take over the farm eventually," she'd say, as if genetics or divine intervention had predetermined this outcome. "He has such a natural way with the land." Never mind that I was the one who'd spent hours learning the names of every wildflower in the back meadow, or that I could identify sick plants faster than anyone else in the family. Those skills didn't count because they weren't loud or obvious or traditionally masculine. When I graduated high school, the family consensus was that I should go to the local community college for something practical. Business administration, maybe, or early childhood education. Something that would keep me close to home and available for whatever the family might need. Jake, meanwhile, was encouraged to follow his dreams to Ohio State, where he'd study computer science and expand his horizons. The message was clear. His future mattered enough to invest in. Mine was expected to revolve around supporting others. I did go to community college, but I studied graphic design and digital marketing, fields my mother barely understood, but couldn't quite argue against since they sounded computer-related and therefore modern. What she didn't realize was that I was building skills that would eventually let me work from anywhere, for anyone, on my own terms. While Jake was learning to code in Columbus, I was learning to create brands, design websites, and market businesses to customers who'd never meet me face-to-face. By the time I was 21, I was freelancing part-time while finishing my associate degree. By 23, I was working full-time for myself, managing a roster of small business clients who paid me more per project than my mother made in a month at the insurance office. But because I worked from home, because my income was Irregular because I didn't punch a time clock or wear business clothes to an office, my work was somehow less real in my family's eyes. Jake graduated and immediately landed a job with a tech startup in Seattle. The family was incredibly proud. He was making $60,000 a year to start, with benefits and stock options and all the markers of traditional success. When he called home to tell us about his first apartment, about the coffee shops and hiking trails and urban lifestyle, my mother would practically glow with pride. "My son, the computer engineer," she'd tell her friends at church. "He's making such a good living out there in Seattle." Meanwhile, I was quietly building something much more substantial. My client base had grown to include restaurants, boutique, shops, and professional service firms across 3 states. I was designing logos, building websites, managing social media campaigns, and consulting on digital marketing strategies. On a good month, I was bringing in $8,000. On a regular month, it was closer to $5,000 or $6,000. But because the money came in chunks rather than steady paychecks, because I didn't have health insurance through an employer, because I worked in my pajamas some days, it didn't register as real success to my family. This is the context you need to understand what happened with the farmhouse. When Grandpa started getting older and needed more help maintaining the property, guess who the family called? Not Jake in Seattle with his demanding job and his new girlfriend and his busy urban life. They called me. I was local. I was available. I had a flexible schedule. What started as occasional favors gradually became regular maintenance, then full responsibility for keeping the place running. Grandpa passed away 2 years ago, just before Christmas. It was sudden, but not unexpected. He'd been slowing down for months, and we all knew his heart wasn't what it used to be. What none of us knew was the state of his finances. Grandpa had always been private about money, the way farmers of his generation often were. He paid his bills, kept his word, and assumed everything else would work itself out. After the funeral, when we started sorting through his papers, the reality became clear. Grandpa had taken out a reverse mortgage on the farm 5 years earlier. He'd needed money for medical expenses, home repairs, daily living costs that his Social Security couldn't cover. The reverse mortgage had seemed like the perfect solution at the time. He could stay in his home, access the equity he'd built up over decades, and not worry about monthly payments. The problem with reverse mortgages is that they become due immediately when the homeowner dies. The house goes into foreclosure unless someone can pay off the entire balance, which in Grandpa's case was nearly $90,000. None of us had that kind of money sitting around, or so I thought at the time. Jake was still paying off student loans and saving for a wedding. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mom had her own mortgage and was talking about wanting to retire in a few years. The assumption was that we'd have to let the bank take the house and divide whatever was left after the sale. But I couldn't bear the thought of losing the farm, not just because of family sentiment, though that was part of it. The practical side of me could see that the property was worth much more than the mortgage balance. The house itself was solid, a beautiful example of 1920s farmhouse architecture with good bones and period details that city people paid premium prices for. The 5 acres included a barn, a workshop, mature fruit trees, and pasture land that could easily support horses or small livestock. In a rapidly developing area like ours, that kind of space was becoming increasingly rare and valuable. So I made a proposal to the family. I would take over the mortgage payments and the property maintenance. In exchange, I'd like to buy the house from the estate for the amount owed to the bank. It seemed fair to everyone. The family would get the debts cleared, I'd get the house, and we could keep the property in the family without losing it to foreclosure. My mother's reaction was immediate and firm. "Oh, honey, that's so sweet of you to offer, but this is too big a responsibility for you. Your income is so unpredictable, and you've never owned property before. What if you can't keep up with the payments?" She suggested instead that we let the bank foreclose, take whatever money was left, and use it to help Jake and his fiancée Emma with a down payment on their own house. I tried to explain that my income was actually quite stable, that I'd been consistently profitable for 3 years, that I had savings and good credit, and a realistic understanding of what home ownership involved. None of that seemed to register. In my mother's mind, I was still the little girl who collected eggs while Jake operated the tractor. The idea that I might be financially capable of taking on a major property investment simply didn't compute. Jake's response was more diplomatic, but equally dismissive. He called me from Seattle to talk through my proposal, which really meant explaining why it wasn't practical. "Sarah, I think it's awesome that you want to help out, but Mom's right that this might be too much for you to handle. Emma and I have been talking, and we think maybe in a few years, when I'm more established in my career, we might want to move back and take over the farm. It would be better to keep things simple for now." What I heard in that conversation was my family's complete inability to see me as an adult with agency and resources. They were so invested in the narrative of Jake as the responsible one, the natural heir, the person whose plans mattered, that they couldn't adjust their perspective to accommodate the reality of who I'd become. I was 26 years old, running a successful business, managing my own finances, and ready to make a significant investment in preserving our family's legacy. But in their eyes, I was still the little sister who needed protection from her own impulses. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I stopped trying to convince them and started taking action on my own. If they couldn't see my capabilities, I'd demonstrate them. If they wouldn't include me in their plans for the property, I'd make my own plans. If they wanted to let the bank foreclose rather than let me prevent it, then I'd work with the bank directly. The foreclosure process takes time, and during those months, I kept driving out to the farmhouse every weekend to maintain the property. I mowed the grass, weeded the gardens, repaired broken shutters, and kept the place looking loved and cared for. My family assumed I was just being helpful, doing what I could during a difficult transition. They had no idea I was also documenting every repair I made, every dollar I spent, every hour I invested in keeping their ancestral home from falling into disrepair. I was also quietly building my business and my savings. Every month, I was setting aside money specifically for the farmhouse. I opened a separate account and funneled my highest-paying projects into it. I researched property auctions, mortgage brokers, and real estate law. I educated myself about foreclosure timelines and redemption periods. I prepared for the moment when the house would go up for auction and I could finally make my move. This time, Jake and Emma were planning their engagement and talking more seriously about their future. They'd decided to stay in Seattle for the foreseeable future, where Jake's career was taking off, and Emma had landed a job she loved. But they still talked about the farmhouse like it was their retirement plan, their eventual family home, the place where they'd raise children someday. My mother encouraged this fantasy, even as the foreclosure proceedings moved forward and the auction date approached. The cognitive dissonance was stunning. They were simultaneously letting the house go to foreclosure and planning their future life there. They were treating my maintenance work as voluntary family service while dismissing my interest in actually purchasing the property. They were so committed to their version of how things should work that they couldn't see how things actually were working. 3 months before the auction, I sat down with David, my boyfriend of 2 years, and showed him my financial projections. David works as an accountant for a mid-sized manufacturing company, so he understands numbers and long-term planning in a way that my family never bothered to learn about my business. When I laid out my savings, my monthly income trends, and my plan for purchasing and renovating the farmhouse, his response was immediate and supportive. "Sarah, you're not just ready for this. You're more prepared than most people who buy their first house. You know this property inside and out. You have the skills to manage most repairs yourself, and you've already proven you can maintain it properly." He paused to look through my documentation again. "The only question is whether you're sure you want to deal with your family's reaction when they realize what you've done." That conversation clarified something important for me. I wasn't just buying a house. I was claiming space for myself in a family that had never quite figured out where I fit. I was proving that their assumptions about my capabilities were wrong. I was taking control of my own future instead of waiting for permission or approval that might never come. The auction was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late March. I'd pre-qualified for financing, but I also had enough cash to make a competitive bid if necessary. I'd researched the property values in the area and knew that even if bidding went higher than expected, I'd still be getting a good investment. Most importantly, I'd made peace with the possibility that my family might never understand or approve of what I was doing. The night before the auction, my mother called to check in. "How are you holding up, sweetie? I know this whole situation with Grandpa's house has been hard on all of us." She spoke as if the foreclosure were a natural disaster rather than a predictable consequence of decisions and circumstances. "Jake and Emma are flying in this weekend to get some of Grandpa's things before the bank takes over. It'll be nice to have one last family gathering there." I listened to her talk about closure and moving forward and new chapters, all while knowing that in 12 hours, I'd be sitting in a courthouse conference room, bidding on the property she was already mourning as lost. The temptation to tell her was enormous, but I resisted. Some conversations are better had after the fact, when the outcome is certain and the other person can't try to talk you out of what you've already accomplished. The morning of the auction, David drove with me to the courthouse. We sat in his car for a few minutes before going inside, and he asked if I was nervous. The truth was, I felt calmer than I had in months. For the first time since Grandpa died, I was taking action instead of just reacting to other people's decisions. Whatever happened in that auction room, I'd know I'd tried to save the house rather than just letting it slip away. The courthouse conference room smelled like industrial carpet and disappointment. Folding chairs were arranged in rows facing a small podium where the auctioneer would conduct the proceedings. I counted maybe 15 other people scattered throughout the room, most of them clearly investors or flippers based on their clipboards and casual confidence. David and I took seats in the third row, close enough to hear everything clearly but not so close that we'd draw attention. The auctioneer was a thin man in his 50s who handled foreclosure auctions like a medical examiner handles autopsies. Professional, efficient, slightly weary from seeing the same tragedy play out over and over. He explained the terms in that rapid-fire legal language that makes everything sound more complicated than it actually is. Cash or certified funds only. No financing contingencies. All sales final. Property sold as is with no warranties or guarantees. When he called out the address of Grandpa's farm, my heart hammered against my ribs. Starting bid was set at $75,000, well below what I knew the property was worth. Two hands went up immediately. The bidding moved quickly at first, jumping in $5,000 increments. $80,000, $85,000, $90,000. I waited, watching the other bidders, trying to gauge their commitment level and financial limits. One of them was clearly a house flipper. He had the look of someone who'd done this dozens of times, casually checking his phone between bids like this was just another Tuesday morning. The other serious bidder was a woman about my mother's age, well-dressed, taking careful notes in a leather portfolio. She might have been looking for a country retreat or investment property. Both of them seemed prepared to go higher, but neither looked desperate. At $95,000, I raised my hand for the first time. The auctioneer's eyes flicked to me briefly, noting a new player in the game. The flipper countered immediately. $100,000. The older woman hesitated for just a moment before raising her hand. $105,000. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. I'd researched comparable sales in the area extensively. Properties with similar acreage and house size had sold for anywhere from $130,000 to $160,000 over the past year. Even if I went as high as $120,000, I'd still be getting an excellent deal on a property I knew intimately. I raised my hand again. $110,000. The flipper looked annoyed but countered. $115. The older woman was studying her notes now, clearly calculating whether the investment still made sense at this price point. She shook her head when the auctioneer looked her way. It was down to me and the flipper. He had the advantage of experience. But I had something more powerful. I wasn't just buying an investment property. I was buying my future home, my family's legacy, my grandfather's life work. There was no dollar amount that could outweigh that kind of motivation. $120,000, $125. The flipper was getting less casual now, actually paying attention instead of scrolling through his phone. At $130,000. He paused longer before raising his hand. I could see him doing the math, trying to figure out if he could still make his profit margin work at this price. When I bid $135,000, he finally shook his head. The auctioneer called for any other bids, waited the required amount of time, then brought his gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed through the small room. Sold to bidder number 47 for $135,000. Bidder number 47 was me. After 26 years of being treated like the family afterthought, I owned the property that everyone assumed would go to my brother. The irony was so perfect it almost felt orchestrated by some cosmic sense of justice. The paperwork process took about an hour. Proof of funds, identity verification, signing documents that transferred ownership from the bank to Sarah Chen, individual property owner. When the clerk handed me the deed with my name typed across the top, I had to read it 3 times before it felt real. David squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "You did it. You actually did it." We drove straight from the courthouse to the farmhouse. I wanted to see it again, knowing that it was mine, that every decision about its future would be mine to make. The gravel driveway crunched under our tires exactly the way it had hundreds of times before, but everything felt different now. This wasn't my grandfather's house anymore, or my family's ancestral property, or Jake's eventual inheritance. This was my home. Standing on the front porch with the keys in my hand, I called my insurance agent to add the property to my policy. Then I called the utility companies to transfer service into my name. These mundane administrative tasks felt revolutionary. For the first time in my life, I was the person making decisions about this place instead of just implementing other people's choices. That evening, David and I sat on the back deck watching the sunset over the meadow where I used to help Grandpa move irrigation lines during summer droughts. "Are you going to tell your family right away?" he asked. I'd been thinking about that question all day. Part of me wanted to call immediately and share the news, maybe even invite them over to celebrate. But a bigger part of me knew that my family's reaction wouldn't be celebration. They'd be shocked, probably upset, definitely confused about how their assumptions had been so completely wrong. I decided to wait until the weekend, when Jake and Emma would be in town for their final visit to collect Grandpa's belongings. Let them have their closure ceremony first. Let them say goodbye to the house they thought was lost forever. Then, I'd tell them it wasn't lost at all. It was just changing hands in a way none of them had anticipated. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I spent Wednesday morning at the bank, officially closing on the mortgage and establishing all the financial accounts associated with home ownership. Property taxes, insurance escrow, utility deposits. The paperwork was overwhelming, but also satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. Every form I signed was evidence that I'd accomplished something my family had thought impossible. Thursday, I drove out to the house with a truck full of cleaning supplies and basic maintenance tools. The place had been empty for months, except for my weekend visits, and it needed a thorough, deep cleaning before I could start thinking about actually moving in. As I worked my way through each room, wiping down surfaces and checking for any damage or needed repairs, I started making mental lists of renovation projects. The kitchen needed updating. Not a complete gut renovation, but new appliances and maybe refinished cabinets. The upstairs bathroom had a leak around the tub that I'd been meaning to address for weeks. The front porch steps were getting wobbly and should be rebuilt before someone got hurt. These weren't overwhelming problems, just the normal maintenance issues that come with any older house. The difference was that now I had the authority to fix them properly instead of just patching them temporarily. Friday afternoon, my mother called with details about Jake and Emma's visit. They'd be arriving Saturday morning and wanted to spend the whole day going through Grandpa's remaining possessions. "It's going to be emotional for all of us," she said. "This really is the end of an era. I hope you can come out and help us get through it." I promised I'd be there, though I didn't mention that I'd been there every day that week already. Saturday morning, I arrived at the farmhouse 30 minutes early and parked in the gravel area beside the barn. My family always parked closer to the house, but I wanted to give them space for their cars and also position myself where I could watch their arrival. Jake's rental car pulled into the driveway at exactly 10 o'clock, followed immediately by my mother's silver Honda. Emma got out first, stretching after the flight from Seattle and looking around at the property with the kind of wistful expression that people get when they're trying to memorize a place they think they'll never see again. Jake climbed out more slowly, clearly tired from traveling, but also carrying himself with that particular weight that comes with difficult family responsibilities. My mother was already organizing the day before she'd even reached the front porch. "Emma, I thought you and Jake could start with the upstairs bedrooms while Sarah and I work on the kitchen and dining room. We brought boxes and packing tape, and I have that list of things Jake specifically wanted to keep." The assumption that I'd automatically slot into the helper role was so automatic, so unthinking, that it took my breath away. Even now, with Jake living across the country and me being the only family member who'd been regularly maintaining this property, I was still just the assistant. Not the person with opinions about what should happen to Grandpa's belongings, not someone whose preferences mattered, just extra hands to help implement other people's decisions. We spent the morning sorting through decades of accumulated possessions. Grandpa had been a keeper of things, wooden crates full of hand tools that were still in perfect condition, kitchen gadgets from the 1960s that worked better than their modern equivalents, books on agriculture and local history, magazines about farming techniques, photo albums documenting 60 years of life on this land. Jake claimed most of the tools, even though he lived in a city apartment and hadn't done manual labor since high school. "I might need these someday," he said, running his hands over a hand-forged hammer that Grandpa had inherited from his own father. "When Emma and I move back here, I'll want to do things the right way." Emma was more practical, choosing items that had clear sentimental value rather than trying to transport an entire workshop across the country. She selected one of Grandpa's quilts, a wooden jewelry box he'd made for Grandma's birthday decades ago, and a small collection of books about wildflowers and native plants. "I want things that will help me remember him specifically," she explained, "not just generic old stuff." My mother focused on photo albums and documents, anything that preserved family history or might be important for tax or legal purposes. She moved through Grandpa's papers with the efficiency of someone who'd been handling other people's administrative details her entire adult life. Bank statements went in one pile, insurance documents in another, random correspondence in a third, pile for later review. I found myself gravitating toward items that reflected Grandpa's daily life on the farm. His leather work gloves, worn smooth by decades of use. A wooden crate he'd built to carry tools between the barn and the house. The blue enamel coffee mug he'd used every morning for as long as I could remember. These weren't valuable or historically significant objects, but they felt like the truest representation of who he'd been. By lunchtime, we'd made significant progress through the house. Jake and Emma had claimed what they wanted from the bedrooms. My mother had sorted most of the paperwork. I'd quietly set aside a few items that I hoped no one would mind me keeping. We took a break on the front porch, eating sandwiches my mother had brought and looking out over the property that would soon belong to whoever bought it at auction. That's when Jake started talking about his long-term plans. "You know, Emma and I have been discussing this more seriously. Maybe in 5 or 6 years, when I'm more established in my career, and we're ready to start a family, we should think about moving back to Ohio. Not necessarily to this exact house, obviously, since it'll be gone by then, but maybe we could find something similar. Rural property, some acreage, a place where kids could grow up the way I did. Emma nodded enthusiastically. I love the idea of raising children with this kind of space and freedom. Jake's told me so many stories about summers here, helping with farm work, learning practical skills. It sounds like such a healthy way to grow up. My mother's face lit up with the kind of joy she usually reserved for major holidays or significant achievements. Oh, that would be wonderful. I've always hoped one of you would want to continue the family tradition of country living. Sarah's such a city girl now with her computer work and everything, but Jake, you've always understood the value of this lifestyle. The casual dismissal hit me like a physical blow. City girl. As if I hadn't spent every weekend for the past 3 years maintaining this exact property. As if I hadn't been the one checking on things during winter storms, coordinating repairs, keeping the place viable while Jake pursued his urban career 3 time zones away. As if my deep knowledge of every inch of this land counted for nothing, because I earned my living with a computer instead of a tractor. I set down my sandwich and looked directly at my mother. Actually, I have some news about the house that you might find interesting. The conversation stopped. Jake lowered his own sandwich, suddenly alert to a shift in tone he couldn't quite identify. Emma looked between us curiously. My mother tilted her head with that particular expression she got when she was trying to figure out what social dynamic she'd missed. "What kind of news, sweetie?" Mom asked. This was the moment I'd been building toward for months. All the secret. Planning, the financial preparation, the documentation of my qualifications and commitment. All the times I'd swallowed my frustration at being dismissed and overlooked. All the conversations where my family had talked around me instead of including me in decisions about this property. "The auction was this week," I said, keeping my voice calm and factual. "Tuesday morning, actually. I was there." Jake straightened up. "You went to watch? That must have been hard, seeing it actually happen." "I didn't go to watch," I said. "I went to bid. And I won." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear a hawk calling from somewhere over the back meadow. My mother's face went through a series of expressions, cycling from confusion to disbelief to something that might have been panic. Jake stared at me like I'd just announced I was moving to Mars. "You won?" Emma asked finally. "You mean you bought the house?" "I bought the house," I confirmed. "For $135,000. Cash deal, closed on Wednesday. I own this property now." My mother's sandwich dropped onto her lap, scattering lettuce and tomato across her jeans. "Sarah, that's impossible. You don't have that kind of money. How could you possibly afford to buy a house?" The question revealed everything I needed to know about how my family saw me and my capabilities. Despite 3 years of successful freelance work, despite my consistent contributions to family events and emergencies, despite my obvious financial stability, my mother literally couldn't conceive of me having enough resources to make a major purchase. In her mind, I was still the little girl who needed help with big decisions. "I've been building my business for 5 years," I said patiently. "I make good money, I save consistently, and I've been preparing for this purchase since Grandpa died. I'm not some impulsive kid who made an emotional decision. I researched the market, got pre-approved for financing, and made a strategic investment in a property I know better than anyone else in this family." Jake was shaking his head slowly, still processing the information. "But Sarah, why didn't you tell us you were planning this? We could have worked something out, maybe pooled our resources or figured out a way to keep it in the family officially." "It is in the family," I replied. "I'm family. And I tried to work something out when Grandpa first died, remember? I offered to take over the mortgage payments and buy the house from the estate. You and Mom decided that was too risky, that I wasn't financially stable enough to handle that kind of responsibility. The memory of that conversation hung in the air between us. My mother's face flushed with what might have been embarrassment or anger or some combination of both. That was different, Sarah. We were trying to protect you from taking on more than you could handle. Buying a foreclosed property at auction is completely different from taking over an existing mortgage. You're right, I agreed. It's much more complicated, requires more capital, and involves significantly more risk, which makes it even more impressive that I was able to do it successfully, don't you think? Emma, to her credit, was the first to move past the shock and toward something resembling congratulations. Sarah, this is amazing. I had no idea you were in a position to do something like this. You must be so proud of yourself. But Jake was still stuck on the logistics and implications. So what happens now? Are you planning to live here full-time? What about your work? What about Mom's idea of eventually giving the house to Emma and me? There it was, the core issue that no one had wanted to address directly. Jake had been operating under the assumption that he would eventually inherit or acquire this property, and my purchase had just demolished that expectation without any consultation or warning. From his perspective, I'd essentially stolen his inheritance, even though that inheritance had never been legally promised or guaranteed. I'm planning to move here gradually, I said. I can work from anywhere with an internet connection, so the location isn't a problem. As for Mom's ideas about who should end up with the house, I think recent events have shown that ideas and reality don't always align the way we expect them to. My mother was recovering her composure, shifting into the tone she used when she needed to correct someone's misunderstanding of how things were supposed to work. Sarah, honey, I think you've gotten a little carried away with excitement and haven't thought this through completely. This house is too big for one person. It needs more maintenance than you realize, and frankly, it doesn't suit your lifestyle. You're used to apartment living, restaurants, urban conveniences. This is going to be much harder than you think. Every word was a small knife, designed to undermine my confidence and decision-making ability. Too big, too much work, doesn't suit my lifestyle. The subtext was clear. I was too small, too weak, too urban, too female to handle the responsibilities of rural property ownership. The same assumptions that had led them to dismiss my original offer to buy the house were now being deployed to convince me I'd made a mistake in actually buying it. But I had 3 years of weekend maintenance to prove otherwise. I had financial records showing my capability to manage major expenses. I had a business that not only supported this investment, but made it a smart, long-term decision. I had documentation of every repair I'd made, every dollar I'd spent, every hour I'd invested in keeping this place viable. Mom, I said quietly, I've been maintaining this house almost single-handedly for 3 years. I know exactly how much work it requires, and I know exactly what my lifestyle can accommodate. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not asking for your permission or approval. I'm just informing you of what I've already done. The conversation might have continued along those lines indefinitely, but David's car was coming up the driveway. I'd texted him after lunch to let him know how the revelation was going, and he'd decided to drive out and provide moral support. His timing was perfect. Nothing reinforces your credibility like having a witness who can confirm your version of events. He parked beside the rental car and walked up to the porch with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there. Hi everyone, Sarah, how's the family meeting going? I just told them about the house, I said. David smiled and shook Jake's hand. Congratulations on your sister's achievement. She's been working toward this for months. It's pretty impressive to see someone set a goal and follow through so completely. The external validation seemed to shift something in the family dynamic. Here was an objective observer confirming that my purchase was noteworthy rather than questionable. David had watched me research comparable sales, save money specifically for this purpose, and manage the entire auction process with competence and foresight. His perspective carried weight because he had no emotional investment in the family hierarchy that had kept me in a supporting role. Over the next hour, the conversation gradually moved from shock and skepticism towards something approaching acceptance. Jake started asking more practical questions about my renovation plans and timeline for moving in. Emma wanted to know about my favorite features of the house and how I envisioned using the space. My mother remained mostly quiet, but she stopped actively arguing against my decision. By late afternoon, when Jake and Emma were loading their selections into the rental car, the family dynamics had shifted into something unrecognizable. Instead of me helping them pack their inherited treasures, they were asking my permission to take items from my house. Instead of planning the final closure of a family property, we were discussing my upcoming housewarming party. The most telling moment came when my mother approached me as I was locking up the house. "Sarah, I want you to know that I'm not upset about what you've done. I'm just surprised. I never realized you were in a position to do something like this." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was an acknowledgement that her assumptions about my capabilities had been wrong. Coming from a woman who rarely admitted being wrong about anything, it felt like progress. That evening, as David and I drove back to my apartment, I felt lighter than I had in months. The secret I'd been carrying was finally out in the open. My family knew that their quiet, helpful daughter had been quietly becoming someone they'd never bothered to notice. The house that they'd assumed was lost forever was actually in exactly the hands where it belonged, someone who loved it enough to fight for it. "How do you feel?" David asked as we pulled into my apartment complex. "Like I finally exist," I said. "Like I'm finally real to them." But even as I said it, I knew the real test was still coming. Buying the house was one thing. Actually living in it, making it my own, proving that I could thrive in the role they'd never imagined me filling that would be the true measure of whether anything had fundamentally changed. The first night I slept in my own house, I woke up at 3 a.m. to absolute silence. Not the muffled city sounds I'd grown accustomed to in my apartment, not the hum of traffic or distant sirens, but the deep quiet that only comes with acres of space between you and your nearest neighbor. I lay in Grandpa's old bedroom, listening to the house settle around me, and realized I was exactly where I belonged. Moving had been a gradual process rather than a dramatic single-day event. Over the course of 3 weeks, I'd been transferring my belongings in careful loads, starting with work essentials, and gradually adding personal items as I finished renovating each room. My apartment lease wasn't up for another 2 months, so I had the luxury of taking my time and making sure everything was properly organized before fully committing to rural life. The kitchen renovation had been my first major project. Grandpa's appliances were vintage in the worst possible way. A Harvest Gold refrigerator from 1978, and an electric range that heated unevenly and made concerning clicking sounds when you turned it on. I'd replaced them with modern, energy-efficient models that actually fit the farmhouse aesthetic better than the outdated fixtures they'd replaced. The cabinets were solid wood underneath decades of paint, so I'd spent a weekend stripping and refinishing them to reveal the beautiful oak grain beneath. David had been invaluable during the renovation process, not just for manual labor, but for his practical perspective on home improvement projects. When I got overwhelmed by the scope of everything that needed attention, he'd help me prioritize, based on safety and functionality rather than trying to do everything at once. "You're not preparing for a magazine photo shoot," he'd remind me when I started obsessing over paint colors. "You're creating a home you can actually live in." Dark. Upstairs bathroom had required professional help. That leak I'd been noticing for months had turned out to be more serious than I'd thought, requiring a complete replacement of the subfloor and some of the wall framing. It was the kind of expensive surprise that homeowners dread, but I'd budgeted for unexpected issues and was able to handle it without financial stress. More importantly, I was able to make decisions about materials and design without having to consult anyone else or justify my choices. That sense of autonomy was intoxicating. When I chose subway tile for the bathroom walls, I didn't have to explain why I preferred it over the floral wallpaper my mother might have suggested. When I decided to paint the living room a warm sage green instead of the safe beige that most people would have chosen, I could simply buy the paint and do it. Every decision was mine to make. Every mistake was mine to learn from. Every success was mine to enjoy. My work routine adapted to country life more easily than I'd expected. The internet connection was actually faster than what I'd had in my apartment, and the extra space meant I could set up a proper home office instead of working from my kitchen table. Clients loved the virtual meeting backgrounds I could create with the farmhouse interiors, and several had commented on how much more relaxed and creative I seemed during our video calls. The real adjustment was learning to manage property maintenance on my own timeline rather than squeezing it into weekends between other obligations. When the irrigation system in the vegetable garden needed repair, I could spend a whole Tuesday morning figuring out the problem instead of just shutting off the water and hoping it would hold until I had time to deal with it properly. When a storm brought down a large branch from the oak tree near the barn, I could clear it immediately instead of letting it sit for weeks because I only visited on Saturdays. 3 weeks after moving in, I hosted my first dinner party. Nothing elaborate, just David and 2 of my closest friends from town, but it felt like a milestone worth celebrating. We ate on the back deck overlooking the meadow, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange that you simply couldn't see from an apartment window. My friend Lisa, who's a nurse at the county hospital, kept shaking her head in amazement. "Sarah, I can't believe you actually did this. When you first started talking about maybe buying a house someday, I thought you meant a cute little place in town with a small yard. This is like something from a magazine." She gestured toward the barn and the pasture beyond. "What are you going to do with all this space?" That question had been occupying my thoughts more and more. The house itself was perfect for my needs, but 5 acres was more land than one person could reasonably use just for gardens and personal enjoyment. I'd been researching agricultural tax exemptions and discovered that if I leased some of the pasture to a local farmer for hay production, I could significantly reduce my property tax burden while keeping the land productive. More intriguingly, I'd been talking to a woman who ran a small business boarding horses for people who lived in town, but wanted to keep their animals on rural property. She was looking for additional pasture space and offered to pay monthly rent, plus handle all the fencing and shelter maintenance. It would be passive income that would help offset my mortgage payments while adding life and activity to the property. These weren't decisions I had to make immediately, but the fact that I could make them at all was revolutionary. For the first time in my life, I had the space and authority to think in terms of long-term land use and investment strategy. I could plan projects that would take years to mature, knowing that I'd be here to see them through. My family's reaction to my successful transition to country living was complicated. My mother called regularly, ostensibly to check on how I was adjusting, but really to fish for evidence that I was in over my head. "How are you managing with the well water, honey? I know city people sometimes have trouble adjusting to the taste." Or, "Have you had any problems with mice in the old house? Sometimes when places sit empty, they can get overrun with rodents." Each question carried the subtext that this lifestyle was beyond my capabilities, that any day now I'd realize my mistake and come running back to apartment living. What she didn't understand was that I'd been preparing for rural home ownership for 3 years. I knew about well water maintenance, pest control, septic system care, and all the other practical aspects of country living that seemed mysterious to people who'd only experienced them secondhand. Jake's response was more subtle, but equally revealing. He'd started calling more frequently, ostensibly to catch up, but really to offer unsolicited advice about property management. "You know, Sarah, if you ever need help with major repairs or anything, I still have connections with some of the contractors who used to work for Grandpa. I could put you in touch with reliable people who won't try to overcharge you. The assumption that I couldn't evaluate contractors on my own or negotiate fair prices was both insulting and completely predictable. Jake had spent his entire adult life being treated as the competent one, the person whose judgment could be trusted with important decisions. The idea that I might be equally capable of managing complex projects didn't fit his mental model of our family roles. Emma, interestingly, was the most genuinely supportive family member. She'd started following my renovation progress on social media and often commented with enthusiasm about my design choices or gardening projects. "I love what you've done with the kitchen. Those cabinets look amazing refinished. You're so talented at this kind of thing." Her praise felt authentic rather than condescending, probably because she didn't have decades of preconceived notions about my capabilities to overcome. The first real test of family dynamics came when my cousin Rachel decided to get married and wanted to have her reception at the family farm. She called me directly, which was already a departure from normal family protocol where such requests would have gone through my mother or Jake first. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me asking, but would you consider letting us use the farmhouse and grounds for my wedding reception in October? I know it's a lot to ask, but that place has so much family history, and it would mean the world to us to celebrate there. We'd pay for everything, of course, and handle all the setup and cleanup." The request put me in an interesting position. On one hand, I loved Rachel and wanted to support her special day. The farmhouse and grounds were absolutely perfect for a wedding reception, with the barn providing shelter if weather was an issue, and the meadow offering a gorgeous natural backdrop for photos. On the other hand, hosting a wedding is a significant undertaking that involves insurance considerations, liability issues, and the potential for property damage. More importantly, agreeing to host family events would set a precedent about my role as the property owner. Was I expected to make the farmhouse available for any family gathering that required space? Would I be consulted about timing and logistics? Or would I just be expected to accommodate whatever plans other people made? I told Rachel I needed to think about it and discuss the practical aspects with David before making a decision. That afternoon, we walked the property together, trying to imagine where tables would go, how parking would work, what kind of weather contingency plans would be needed. The logistics were manageable, but the conversation helped me clarify what boundaries I needed to establish. "The thing is," I explained to David as we stood in the meadow where the ceremony would probably take place, "if I say yes to this, I need to make sure I'm saying yes as the property owner who's doing Rachel a favor, not as the family member who's expected to provide free venue space whenever someone needs it." David nodded thoughtfully. "So you need to treat this like any other event rental. Contract, deposit, insurance requirements, all of that. If they're not willing to handle it professionally, then they're not really ready to use your property." That conversation helped me realize how much my perspective had shifted since buying the house. 6 months ago, if a family member had asked to use the farmhouse for an event, I would have automatically said yes and worried about details later. Now I was thinking like a property owner who needed to protect her investment and establish appropriate boundaries. When I called Rachel back the next day, I laid out my conditions clearly. Professional event insurance naming me as an additional insured party. A damage deposit equal to 2 months of my mortgage payment. A detailed contract specifying exactly what areas of the property could be used and what cleanup responsibilities the wedding party would assume. Most importantly, all arrangements would be made directly with me rather than going through other family members who might make assumptions about what I'd be willing to accommodate. Rachel was initially surprised by the formality of my requirements, but she agreed to everything without argument. "Sarah, you're absolutely right to ask for all of this. I should have thought of the insurance and liability issues myself. The last thing I want is for you to be stuck with problems because of our party." My mother's reaction to the wedding plans was much less positive. When Rachel mentioned that she'd need to get event insurance and sign a contract, Mom called me immediately. Sarah, honey, don't you think you're being a little bit harsh with Rachel? She's family. We don't usually make family members jump through hoops like they're strangers renting a venue. The conversation that followed was one of those defining moments that clarify exactly where everyone stands. My mother couldn't understand why I was treating my own cousin like a business client, instead of just saying yes and trusting that everything would work out fine. From her perspective, requiring formal agreements suggested that I didn't trust my family or that I cared more about money than relationships. From my perspective, requiring formal agreements was exactly how you preserve relationships when significant money and property are involved. I'd seen too many family disasters that started with good intentions and informal arrangements that nobody had thought through completely. Rachel's wedding was going to involve 50 people, professional catering, a rented dance floor, and probably some level of alcohol consumption. The potential for expensive accidents was real, and I wasn't willing to risk my financial security on the assumption that family members would automatically cover any damages they caused. "Mom," I said as patiently as I could manage, "this isn't about trust or family relationships. This is about being responsible. If someone gets hurt at the reception, or if there's property damage, having proper insurance protects everyone involved." Rachel understands that. She's not offended by my requirements because she's planning a professional event, not a backyard barbecue. But I could hear in my mother's voice that she thought I was being cold and calculating, more concerned with protecting myself than supporting family. The conversation ended with her saying she hoped homeownership wouldn't change me in ways that made me forget what was really important. That comment bothered me for days afterward. Was I becoming too focused on practical considerations? Was I losing the generous, accommodating spirit that had always defined my role in the family? Or was I finally learning to value my own interests and security instead of automatically prioritizing everyone else's convenience? David helped me work through those questions during one of our evening walks around the property. "Sarah, you've spent your whole life being the person who says yes to everything and figures out the details later. You've been the one who absorbs the cost and hassle when things go wrong because you're too nice to make a fuss about it. That's not generosity. It's people-pleasing." He paused to point out a red-winged blackbird perched on the fence post near the pond. Real generosity is when you have boundaries and choose to extend them for someone. Saying yes because you can't figure out how to say no isn't generous, it's just conflict avoidance. His words helped me realize that my family's discomfort with my new approach wasn't really about insurance forms or damage deposits. They were uncomfortable with me acting like someone whose time, property, and financial security mattered enough to protect. They preferred the version of me who absorbed costs and risks without complaint, who made their lives easier by never requiring them to think through the full implications of their requests. The wedding preparations continued over the following weeks, and I found myself enjoying the planning process more than I'd expected. Rachel and her fiancé Tom were organized, communicative, and respectful of my property and my time. They scheduled site visits at my convenience, included me in vendor meetings that would affect my land, and kept me updated on guest counts and timeline changes that might impact logistics. Working with them reminded me why I'd loved event planning aspects of my graphic design business. There was satisfaction in coordinating multiple moving parts to create something beautiful and memorable. The difference was that this time, I was doing it as the property owner rather than just the helpful family member who got volunteered for setup and cleanup duty. 3 weeks before the wedding, my mother made an unexpected announcement during one of our regular phone calls. She'd decided to throw Rachel an engagement party at her own house the weekend before the wedding. I thought it would be nice to have a more intimate family gathering to celebrate the couple before the big formal reception, she explained. Nothing elaborate, just immediate family and a few close friends. It doesn't matter who told me about it. What matters is that you let this family lose a property that could have been saved, then spent months making me feel guilty for not being more accommodating to family needs. You created the crisis that led to me having to buy this house at auction, then tried to convince me I was selfish for not giving it up when Jake decided he wanted it back. I could hear my mother breathing on the other end of the line, but she didn't try to deny what I'd said or offer explanations for her decisions. The truth was too well documented for deflection to work. "Sarah, I know how this must look to you, but the situation was more complicated than you understand. That money came with restrictions and conditions that would have made it difficult to use for the foreclosure situation. I was trying to preserve it for future family needs, rather than throwing it away on a property that might not have been savable anyway. The excuses were weak, and we both knew it. Trust funds designated for property maintenance don't come with restrictions that prevent their use for exactly the kind of major financial crisis they're designed to address. My mother had made a calculated decision to let the foreclosure proceed, probably believing that it would ultimately benefit Jake, in some way she'd never bothered to explain. Mom, I don't need you to justify your decisions to me. I just need you to understand that I know what actually happened, and I'm not going to let you use guilt and family obligation to pressure me into fixing problems that you created. Jake and Emma can find their own house. I'm keeping mine." The conversation ended shortly after that, without resolution, but with a much clearer understanding of where we stood. My mother now knew that I had information that could cause serious problems for her relationship with Jake and Emma if I chose to share it. I knew that her previous attempts to manipulate my decisions had been even more calculated and deceptive than I'd originally understood. Over the following weeks, something interesting happened. My mother stopped calling regularly with suggestions about how I should manage my property or my life. Jake and Emma found a beautiful house in a Columbus suburb without any assistance from family members, and they seemed genuinely excited about their new life in Ohio. The pressure campaign to get me to sell or share the farmhouse simply evaporated, as if it had never existed. At first, I wondered if my mother was just regrouping for another attempt at manipulation, but as months passed without any resurrection of the old arguments, I began to think that she'd finally accepted that I wasn't the malleable family member she'd assumed I would always be. The information about the trust fund had shifted our relationship in a fundamental way, giving me leverage that couldn't be dismissed or undermined. Jake and Emma settled into their new life in Columbus, and we actually began developing a better relationship than we'd had when the farmhouse was a source of conflict between us. Without the pressure of competing for family property or dealing with our mother's expectations about who should inherit what, we could interact as siblings who genuinely liked each other rather than rivals in some complex family hierarchy. Emma, in particular, became a real friend during this period. She started visiting the farmhouse regularly to photograph my renovation projects for her interior design portfolio, and she often stayed for dinner to catch up on each other's lives. Through her, I learned that Jake had never been as invested in acquiring the farmhouse as our mother had claimed. His interest had been more about nostalgia and family connection than genuine desire to take on rural property management. "Honestly, Sarah," Emma told me during one of our dinner conversations, "Jake was relieved when you refused to sell to us. He loved the idea of the farmhouse in theory, but he was dreading the practical reality of maintaining a property that size, while trying to establish himself in a new job. Your mother was much more invested in us taking over than we were in actually taking over." That revelation helped explain some of the dynamics I'd been puzzling over for months. My mother's pressure campaign hadn't been about giving Jake something he desperately wanted. It had been about implementing her vision of how family assets should be distributed, with Jake as the responsible landowner and me as the supportive sister who facilitated his success rather than pursuing her own. The discovery of the trust fund had revealed the length she was willing to go to control those outcomes, even when it meant deceiving her own children and sabotaging family financial security. But it had also given me the information I needed to permanently end those manipulation attempts and establish my independence from family expectations that had never been based on my actual capabilities or desires. A year later, David and I were married in the back meadow of the farmhouse, with a small ceremony that included only the people who genuinely supported our choices and respected our autonomy. My mother attended and seemed to enjoy herself, though she made no attempts to offer advice about wedding planning or suggestions about how we should arrange our married life. Jake and Emma were there, along with Rachel and her husband, and several friends who'd become like family during my transition to country living. The wedding was everything I'd wanted it to be: personal, meaningful, and completely under my control. We served food I'd chosen, music we loved, and celebrated in a space that belonged to us without any need to accommodate other people's preferences or expectations. It was the perfect symbol of the life I'd built since buying the farmhouse, a life based on my own values and priorities rather than inherited obligations. During the reception, as I watched our guests laughing and dancing under string lights we'd hung between the oak trees, I thought about how different this celebration was from Rachel's wedding the year before. That event had been beautiful, but it had also been a performance for family members who had their own ideas about how things should be done. This was simply a party for people who loved us as we actually were, rather than as they thought we should be. My mother approached me near the end of the evening, as we were starting to clean up and say goodbye to the last guests. "Sarah, I want you to know that this was a lovely wedding, and I'm proud of what you've accomplished here. I may not have understood your choices initially, but I can see that you've built something really special." But it wasn't a complete apology for the years of dismissiveness and manipulation, but it was an acknowledgement that I'd been right about my own capabilities and desires. Coming from someone who rarely admitted being wrong about anything, it felt like a significant step toward a relationship based on mutual respect rather than inherited hierarchy. "Thank you, Mom," I said. "That means a lot to me." David and I spent our honeymoon at the farmhouse, taking long walks around the property and making plans for future projects. We talked about expanding the vegetable garden, maybe adding a workshop space in the barn, possibly getting some chickens or goats to complete the small farm operation we were gradually developing. These weren't dreams anymore. They were achievable. Goals for people who owned their own land and had the freedom to make their own decisions about how to use it. The house my mother had said was, for real family only, had become exactly that, but not in the way she'd originally intended. It was home to a family that David and I were creating based on love and mutual respect rather than obligation and inherited expectations. A family that included chosen friends who valued our happiness, rather than blood relatives who saw us as supporting characters in their own stories. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd never discovered the truth about Grandpa's trust fund, if I'd continued believing that my family's financial difficulties had been genuine rather than manufactured. I might have eventually given in to the pressure to sell or share the farmhouse, might have continued being the accommodating daughter who prioritized other people's comfort over her own autonomy. Instead, I learned that the most important thing you can inherit from your family isn't money or property, but the knowledge of what you're capable of achieving when you stop waiting for permission to live your own life. The farmhouse was just the beginning. The real inheritance was the confidence to claim space for myself in a world that had always assumed I was meant to take up less room than I actually needed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. But that theory fell apart when I remembered that Jake had been planning to stay in Seattle indefinitely. He wasn't expecting to inherit the farmhouse immediately, and he certainly wasn't prepared to take on property management responsibilities while living across the country. My mother's decision to hide the trust fund didn't benefit Jake in any obvious way. 3 days later, Gregory called back with information that was even more disturbing than I'd anticipated. The trust account had indeed existed, with a balance of just over $43,000 at the time of Grandpa's death. But instead of being used for property maintenance or disclosed to the family as a whole, the funds had been transferred to a personal account belonging to my mother within 6 weeks of Grandpa's funeral. The bank records show that Linda accessed the account using her executor authority and move the entire balance to her personal savings, Gregory explained. There's no documentation indicating that this transfer was intended to preserve the funds for later property-related expenses. From the bank's perspective, it appears to be a standard inheritance distribution. But it wasn't a standard inheritance distribution because the trust had been specifically designated for property maintenance, not general family assets. My mother had essentially stolen money that was meant to save the farmhouse, then allowed the property to go into foreclosure while claiming that the family couldn't afford to prevent it. I asked Gregory what legal options might be available for recovering the funds, but his answer wasn't encouraging. As the executor of the estate, my mother had broad authority to manage financial assets, and proving that she'd violated the specific terms of the trust would require extensive documentation that might not still exist. More importantly, since I'd already successfully purchased the property and completed renovations, I'd be hard-pressed to demonstrate financial damages that would justify the cost of litigation. From a practical standpoint, Gregory said, you're in a better position now than you would have been if the trust funds had been used as originally intended. You own the property outright, you've increased its value significantly through your renovations, and you've established yourself as the rightful owner without any ongoing obligations to other family members. He was right from a legal and financial perspective, but emotionally, the discovery felt like a betrayal that went deeper than anything I'd experienced during the open conflicts over boundaries and expectations. My mother hadn't just dismissed my capabilities or assumed I couldn't handle home ownership. She'd actively sabotaged my family's ability to keep the property while positioning herself as someone who'd tried her best to help during a difficult situation. That evening, I sat on my back deck with David, watching the horses in the pasture, and trying to process what this new information meant for my relationship with my family. David listened quietly as I explained what Gregory had discovered, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting me work through the implications out loud. The thing that gets me, I said finally, is that she's been making me feel guilty for months about not being more accommodating, not being the helpful daughter who puts family first. And the whole time, she was the one who prevented the family from staying together around this property. David nodded slowly. It sounds like she wanted to control the outcome rather than just let things happen naturally. Maybe she thought that if the house went to foreclosure and got bought by a stranger, it would force Jake and Emma to move back and buy something else nearby. Maybe she thought you'd be content to stay in your apartment and continue being the helpful sister who doesn't need her own space. His analysis made sense, but it also revealed how fundamentally my mother had misunderstood both of her children. Jake had never expressed serious interest in returning to Ohio until the farmhouse was already lost, and even then, his interest had been more about reclaiming something he felt he'd missed rather than genuine enthusiasm for rural living. I'd been the one actually maintaining the property and building skills that would translate to successful home ownership, but she'd never taken my attachment to the land seriously. "So, what are you going to do with this information?" David asked. That was the question I'd been avoiding all day. I could confront my mother directly about the hidden trust fund, demand an explanation for her decision to conceal resources that could have prevented the foreclosure. I could tell Jake and Emma what I'd discovered, let them know that their inheritance had been manipulated by someone they trusted to handle estate matters fairly. I could create a family crisis that would force everyone to acknowledge the extent of my mother's deception. Or I could keep the information to myself and continue building the life I'd created without getting dragged back into family drama that wouldn't change anything about my current situation. I owned the farmhouse. I loved living there, and my relationships with family members had stabilized into something that worked even if it wasn't perfect. Revealing my mother's financial manipulation would satisfy my need for justice, but it wouldn't improve my daily life or help me achieve any goals that mattered to me. I decided to take a middle path. I would document everything Gregory had discovered, keep copies of all the financial records he'd obtained, and hold that information as insurance against future attempts by my family to undermine my position or guilt me into making decisions that weren't in my best interest. But I wouldn't actively use the information to create conflict unless my mother tried to resurrect the pressure campaign about selling the property or accommodating unreasonable demands. 2 weeks later, my decision was tested when my mother called with what she presented as exciting news. Jake's company had officially decided to open a Midwest regional office, and he'd been offered the position of managing director with a substantial salary increase and relocation assistance. Emma had found a freelance interior design opportunity with a Columbus-based firm that specialized in high-end residential projects. They were planning to move back to Ohio within 6 months. "Isn't this wonderful, Sarah?" my mother said, her voice bright with the kind of enthusiasm she usually reserved for major family milestones. "Jake and Emma will finally be close to home again, and they'll be able to help with family responsibilities the way they always wanted to." I waited for her to get to the real point of the call. Of course, they'll need to find housing pretty quickly, and the real estate market is so competitive right now. I was thinking that maybe we should revisit that conversation about them taking over the farmhouse. You've had almost a year to experience country living, and now that you know what's involved, maybe you'd be more open to an arrangement that would benefit everyone. There it was. My mother was using Jake and Emma's return to Ohio as leverage to reopen negotiations about my property. She was betting that I'd feel guilty about living alone in a large house while my brother struggled to find suitable accommodations for his family in a competitive market. But this time, I had information that completely changed the power dynamic of our conversation. I knew that my mother had manipulated the estate settlement to prevent the family from keeping the farmhouse through the trust funds. I knew that her concern about my ability to handle home ownership had been cover for her own desire to control how family assets were distributed. Most importantly, I knew that her current pressure campaign wasn't based on genuine concern for anyone's well-being, but on her need to fix a situation that her own deception had created. "Mom," I said calmly, "I'm not interested in selling or sharing my house with Jake and Emma. They're capable adults with good incomes who can find their own housing. And before you start the guilt trip about family obligations, I think we need to have a conversation about Grandpa's trust account." The silence on the other end of the phone was immediate and complete. No questions about what trust account I was referring to, no confusion about what I might have discovered. Just silence that confirmed she knew exactly what I was talking about. "I'm not sure what you mean, Sarah," she said finally, but her tone had changed completely. The cheerful manipulativeness was gone, replaced by something much more careful and defensive. "I mean the $43,000 that Grandpa set aside specifically for property maintenance and improvements. The money that was supposed to prevent exactly the kind of foreclosure crisis that happened after his death. The money that you transferred to your personal account instead of using to save the farmhouse." Another silence, longer this time. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was small and tight. "Who told you about that?" His outside perspective seemed to carry weight with my family in a way that my own words hadn't. Here was an objective observer confirming that I was making rational decisions based on accurate information about my own capabilities and preferences. But even with David's validation, I could see that my family wasn't ready to abandon their version of what my life should look like. The conversation ended without resolution, but with a much clearer understanding of where everyone stood. Jake and Emma left for Seattle the next day, disappointed but not hostile. My mother continued to call regularly, but she stopped suggesting that I reconsider my living situation or offering unsolicited advice about property management. Over the following months, something interesting happened. Without the constant pressure to prove myself or justify my choices, I was able to simply enjoy the life I'd built. The horse boarding arrangement worked out beautifully, providing steady passive income while adding life and activity to the property. Rachel's wedding had been such a success that 2 other couples asked about using the farmhouse for their celebrations, leading to a small but profitable event hosting business. My graphic design work continued to flourish, with several clients. specifically choosing me because they loved the story of my rural business location and the creativity they associated with country living. David and I got engaged the following spring, with plans for a small ceremony in the farmhouse's back meadow, where we'd had so many important conversations about boundaries, autonomy, and building the life we actually wanted, rather than the life other people expected us to want. My family gradually adjusted to the reality that I wasn't going to outgrow this phase or return to their preferred version of my life. Jake and Emma ended up buying a beautiful new construction home in a Columbus suburb, where Jake could commute to his company's expanded Ohio operations, while Emma started the interior design business she'd always dreamed about. It turned out that what they'd really wanted wasn't specifically the farmhouse, but the opportunity to return to Ohio and build their own version of success. My mother took longer to make peace with my choices, but she eventually admitted that she was proud of what I'd accomplished, even if it wasn't what she'd envisioned for me. "You know, Sarah," she said during one of our holiday phone calls, "I never thought you had it in you to be so determined about something. I'm still not sure country living is right for you long term, but I can see that you're happy." It wasn't a complete understanding, but it was progress. She was beginning to see me as someone whose happiness mattered, whose choices deserved respect even when they didn't align with her preferences. That was more than I'd ever expected from someone who'd spent my entire childhood assuming my role was to support other people's dreams rather than pursue my own. The farmhouse became everything I'd hoped it would be when I first made the decision to bid at that auction. A place where I could make decisions without consultation, pursue projects without justification, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than inherited family dynamics. David and I host dinner parties for friends who appreciate good food and country views. We're planning a large vegetable garden and considering adding chickens to the small farm operation we're gradually developing. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd accepted my family's assumptions about my capabilities and let the farmhouse go to foreclosure. Jake and Emma would have eventually found another property to buy. My mother would have continued, treating me like the helpful daughter who never quite measured up to her responsible son. I would have remained in my apartment, financially stable, but never challenged to grow beyond the role I'd been assigned in childhood. Instead, I own 5 acres of beautiful land, a house that reflects my taste and values, and a life that I designed rather than inherited. When people ask me about the experience of buying the farmhouse, I tell them it taught me that the most important property you can own is your own sense of what's possible. Once you claim that, everything else becomes achievable. The house my mother said was for real family only turned out to be exactly that. It just took me buying it to discover that I was real family too. 6 months after refusing to sell my farmhouse to Jake and Emma, I discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about my family's financial motivations. It started with a phone call from Gregory Bell, the same estate attorney who had handled Grandpa's affairs after his death. I'd maintained a professional relationship with him for property-related legal questions. So when his name appeared on my caller ID on a Tuesday morning in March, I assumed he was following up on some routine paperwork. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly, but something has come to my attention that I think you should know about," Gregory said, his voice carrying an unusual tension. "I've been handling the estate planning for your great-aunt Margaret, and during our discussions about family assets, she mentioned something about your grandfather's property that doesn't align with what I understood from our previous conversations. My great-aunt Margaret was my grandfather's sister, a sharp-minded woman in her 80s who lived in a retirement community about an hour away. I'd always liked her, though we didn't visit often since she and my mother had some long-standing disagreement about something that happened decades ago. Margaret had a reputation for speaking her mind regardless of whether people wanted to hear what she had to say." "What kind of thing did she mention?" I asked, settling into my desk chair and opening a notebook to take notes. "According to Margaret, your grandfather had established a trust account specifically for property maintenance and improvements about 5 years before his death. The funds were intended to ensure that whoever inherited the farmhouse would have resources available for major repairs or renovations without having to drain their personal savings. My pen stopped moving across the page. A trust account? I never heard anything about that when we were settling his estate. Gregory's pause was telling. That's what concerns me. Margaret was quite specific about the details. She said your grandfather had deposited nearly $40,000 into this account over a 3-year period, with instructions that it should be transferred to whoever took responsibility for maintaining the family property. The implications hit me immediately. If such an account existed and hadn't been disclosed during the estate settlement, someone had deliberately hidden it from the family. More troubling, if the account was specifically designated for property maintenance, it should have been available to me as the person who had been handling those responsibilities for years before Grandpa's death. Gregory, who was the executor of my grandfather's estate? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. Your mother, Linda Chen, served as the primary executor with your Uncle Robert as the secondary. All financial disclosures went through her first. My stomach dropped. My mother had been responsible for identifying and distributing all of Grandpa's assets, including any trust accounts or designated funds. If she'd known about money specifically set aside for property maintenance and hadn't mentioned it, that meant she'd deliberately concealed resources that could have prevented the foreclosure entirely. Is there any way to verify whether this account actually existed? I asked. Margaret provided me with the name of the bank and the approximate account numbers. With your permission as the current property owner, I could make some inquiries to determine what happened to those funds. I gave Gregory permission to investigate, but I already suspected what he would find. My mother had known about the trust account, had access to it as the executor, and had chosen not to use it to save the farmhouse from foreclosure. Instead, she'd let the property go to auction while hiding the existence of funds that could have resolved the financial crisis entirely. The question was why? Why would she conceal resources that could have kept the property in the family? Why would she allow a foreclosure to proceed when she had the means to prevent it? The only explanation that made sense was that she'd wanted the foreclosure to happen, wanted the property to be lost so that Jake couldn't inherit it directly and would have to find another way to establish himself as a landowner. The purchase price, the renovation costs, everything. You wouldn't lose any money, and you'd be free to buy something more suitable for your actual needs. My mother nodded approvingly. It really would be the best solution for everyone, Sarah. You've proved your point about being capable and independent, but now it's time to be practical about what makes sense long-term. There it was. They were offering to buy my house from me, at cost, with no profit or appreciation, as if they were doing me a tremendous favor by taking this burdensome property off my hands. They'd calculated that I'd invested about $150,000 total between the purchase price and renovations, and they were prepared to write me a check for that amount in exchange for the deed to a property that was now worth at least $200,000. More importantly, they were operating under the assumption that I'd want to sell, that I'd been struggling with homeownership and would be grateful for an exit strategy. They'd completely missed the fact that I loved living here, that the farmhouse had become my home in every meaningful sense, that I had long-term plans for the property that extended far beyond just proving I could handle the initial purchase. That's a very interesting proposal, I said carefully, but I'm not interested in selling. This is my home now. I have no intention of moving back to town or giving up the life I've built here. The silence that followed was thick with surprise and disapproval. My family had clearly expected me to jump at their offer, to be relieved that they were willing, to take this overwhelming responsibility off my shoulders. The idea that I might actually want to keep the property hadn't seriously occurred to them. Jake tried a different approach. Sarah, I know you're attached to this place, but you need to think about this practically. What happens when you want to travel, or when you get married and want to move somewhere else? You're tying up all your capital in a property that's going to be difficult to sell when you're ready for the next phase of your life. What makes you think I want to travel or move somewhere else? I asked. What makes you assume this is a temporary phase instead of the life I've chosen? My mother stepped in with the tone she used when she needed to help someone understand something they were too emotional to see clearly. Honey, you're 28 years old. You're not going to want to live alone in the country forever. When you meet the right person and start thinking about marriage and children, you're going to want to be closer to schools and medical facilities and all the conveniences that families need. The assumptions embedded in that statement were staggering. That I wasn't already with the right person in David. That marriage and children were inevitable goals that would override my chosen lifestyle. That country living was incompatible with family life, despite the fact that I'd grown up visiting this exact property and loving every aspect of rural childhood. Mom, David, and I are perfectly happy with our life here. If we decide to get married and have children, this property would be ideal for raising a family. There are excellent schools within reasonable driving distance, the same medical facilities that served our family when I was growing up, and space for children to explore and learn in ways that aren't possible in town. But I could see that my family wasn't really listening to my actual words. They were so invested in their narrative about what my life should look like that they couldn't adjust to the reality of what my life actually looked like. In their minds, I was a young professional who belonged in an urban environment, temporarily, playing house in the country until I came to my senses and returned to a more appropriate lifestyle. The conversation continued for another hour, with Jake and Emma presenting increasingly elaborate arguments about why selling to them would be the smart financial decision. They talked about maintenance costs, property taxes, the challenges of rural internet for my business, the isolation from social and cultural opportunities. Every point was carefully chosen to highlight potential problems with my current situation, while positioning their offer as the obvious solution. What they didn't understand was that they were criticizing choices I'd already considered and rejected. I'd done the math on maintenance costs and found them manageable within my budget. I'd researched rural internet options and upgraded to a business class connection that exceeded what I'd had in town. I'd evaluated the social and cultural trade-offs and decided that the peace and space of country living were worth more to me than easy access to restaurants and entertainment venues. Finally, I stood up from the kitchen table where we'd been having this discussion. I appreciate that you think you're looking out for my best interests, but you're not. You're looking out for your own interests while telling yourselves it's for my benefit. Jake, you want this property because it represents family legacy and childhood memories. Emma, you want it because you've romanticized country living and think it would be nice to have space for horses and gardens. That's fine. Those are valid reasons to want something, but they're not reasons for me to give up something I've worked for and love. I looked directly at my mother. And Mom, you want Jake to have this property because it fits your vision of how our family should work, with him as the responsible landowner carrying on traditions while I play a supporting role, somewhere in the background. But that vision was never based on what either of us actually wanted or were capable of. It was based on assumptions you made when we were children and never bothered to update. The room was completely silent. I'd never spoken to my family this directly before, never laid out the dynamics that usually stayed hidden beneath layers of politeness and accommodation. But owning this property had given me something I'd never had before: the security to speak my truth without worrying about being cut off or rejected. Jake was the first to respond. Sarah, I think you're misinterpreting our concerns. We're not trying to take anything away from you. We're trying to help you make a smart decision about your future. No, Jake, you're trying to convince me that what I want isn't what I really want. You're trying to convince me that my choices aren't sustainable or practical, so that I'll agree to what you want without you having to admit that you're asking me to sacrifice my happiness for yours. David had been quiet throughout this entire conversation, but now he stepped forward to stand beside me. I think what Sarah is saying is that you're all operating from assumptions that don't match reality. She's not struggling with homeownership. She's thriving. She's not isolated or overwhelmed. She's building exactly the life she wants. Your offer isn't helping her solve a problem because she doesn't have the problem you think she has. The timing struck me as odd, since most engagement parties happen months before the wedding rather than days before. But I assumed Mom was just excited about Rachel's upcoming marriage and wanted to add her own contribution to the celebration. I offered to help with food preparation or decorations, the same way I'd always participated in family events. "Oh, that's sweet of you to offer, honey. But I think I have everything under control. Actually, I was hoping you could do me a different kind of favor." There was something in her tone that made me pay closer attention. "I invited Jake and Emma to fly in for the engagement party. They're so disappointed that they're going to miss the actual wedding because of work commitments, and I thought this would be a chance for them to celebrate with Rachel before the big day." I waited for her to get to the actual favor part of the request. "The thing is, their flight doesn't get in until Friday evening, and they need to fly back Sunday morning, so they don't really have time to get a hotel room. I was wondering if they could stay at the farmhouse for the weekend, just Friday and Saturday night. They'd love to see what you've done with the place, and it would be so much more comfortable for them than trying to find last-minute accommodations." There it was. My mother had planned an event, invited people to attend without checking their travel logistics, and now needed me to provide free lodging to make her planning work. The request itself wasn't unreasonable, and under normal circumstances I would have been happy to host Jake and Emma for a weekend. But the way the request was presented, as if my guest rooms were automatically available for family use whenever needed, triggered every boundary issue I'd been working through since buying the house. "Mom, I need to think about that weekend and get back to you," I said. "I might have other plans that would conflict with having house guests." The silence on the other end of the phone was telling. My mother was clearly expecting an automatic yes, the same way she'd always expected me to accommodate family needs without question. The idea that I might have my own agenda, or that hosting unexpected guests might require advanced planning, hadn't occurred to her. "What kind of plans could you possibly have that would be more important than helping your brother?" she asked, and I could hear the edge of irritation in her voice. "Sarah, they're only asking for a place to sleep for 2 nights. It's not like they're asking you to entertain them or cook elaborate meals." But that wasn't really the point, and we both knew it. The point was whether I was going to establish myself as someone whose schedule and space required respect, or whether I was going to continue being the family member who was always available for last-minute requests, because everyone assumed I had nothing more important to do. I told my mother I'd call her back the next day with an answer. That evening, I talked through the situation with David, trying to figure out why a simple request for weekend accommodations felt so loaded with larger implications. It's not about Jake and Emma, I realized as we discussed it. It's about whether I'm going to be the farmhouse owner who graciously opens her home when it's convenient for her, or whether I'm going to be the family accommodation service that's always available when other people need something. The distinction mattered more than I'd initially understood. If I said yes to this request, I'd be signaling that my space was available for family use whenever someone else's planning fell short. If I said no, I'd be establishing that my home was my own and that even family members needed to respect my autonomy and schedule. The decision I made would set the tone for every future family interaction involving my property. I decided to say no to hosting Jake and Emma, but I wanted to do it in a way that was clear without being unnecessarily harsh. When I called my mother back the next morning, I explained that I already had plans for that weekend that couldn't be changed. It wasn't technically a lie. I did have plans to finish installing new light fixtures in the guest bathroom and to meet with the horseboarding woman about pasture arrangements. These weren't the kind of urgent commitments that most people would consider unchangeable, but they were my plans for my house on my schedule. My mother's response was immediate and sharp. "Sarah, I think you're taking this homeowner thing a little too seriously. We're talking about family here, not strangers asking for free accommodations. Jake is your brother. He helped raise you when Dad was working those long hours at the plant. Don't you think you owe him a little consideration?" The guilt trip was expertly deployed, hitting all the familiar pressure points about family loyalty and childhood obligations. But something had shifted in me since buying the farmhouse. I'd spent 3 years watching Jake be prioritized over me in every family decision, watching my contributions be minimized while his preferences were elevated to the level of sacred duty. The idea that I owed him consideration when he'd never been asked to extend the same courtesy to me felt absurd. "Mom, Jake can afford a hotel room. This isn't about not wanting to help family. This is about not being treated like family accommodations are automatically available whenever someone else's planning falls short." I kept my voice steady, but I could feel my patience wearing thin. If you'd asked me 2 weeks ago when you were planning this party, I might have been able to work something out. But expecting me to rearrange my weekend at the last minute isn't reasonable, even for family. The conversation went downhill from there. My mother accused me of becoming selfish since buying the house, of caring more about property than people, of forgetting where I came from. I tried to explain that having boundaries wasn't the same as being selfish, but she wasn't interested in understanding the distinction. In her mind, good family members said yes to whatever was asked of them, and my newfound ability to say no was evidence of some moral failing. We hung up without resolving anything, and I spent the rest of the day feeling unsettled. Part of me wondered if I was being unnecessarily rigid about a relatively minor request. Jake and Emma were decent people who wouldn't trash my house or create major problems. But a larger part of me knew that this wasn't really about one weekend. This was about whether I was going to continue being the family member who absorbed inconvenience so everyone else could live more comfortably. David found me that evening sitting on the back deck, staring out at the meadow without really seeing it. "You're second-guessing yourself," he said, settling into the chair beside me. "Maybe I am being too harsh," I admitted. "It's just 2 nights. Jake's my brother. Maybe I should just suck it up and say yes." David was quiet for a moment, watching. A deer pick its way delicately across the far edge of the pasture. "Can I ask you something? In all the years you've known Jake, has he ever rearranged his plans to accommodate something you needed?" I thought about it honestly. Jake had always been supportive in general ways, calling to check on me when I was going through difficult times, sending birthday gifts, maintaining the basic connections that siblings maintain. But had he ever actually inconvenienced himself for my benefit? Had he ever changed his travel plans, or adjusted his schedule, or made sacrifices to help me with something important? The answer was no. Not because he was malicious or uncaring, but because he'd never been asked to. The family dynamics had always been structured so that I was the one who adapted, compromised, and accommodated. Jake's time was valuable, his plans were important, his preferences mattered. Mine were secondary considerations that could be adjusted as needed. "You're right," I said finally. "I can't think of a single time he's been asked to be inconvenienced. For my benefit. But I've been rearranging my life to make things easier for him since we were kids." That realization crystallized something important for me. This wasn't about being petty or vindictive toward Jake personally. This was about refusing to continue a pattern where my autonomy was automatically sacrificed for other people's convenience. Jake could find a hotel room. My mother could plan events with realistic timelines. The world would not end if I prioritized my own schedule for once. The engagement party happened without me providing emergency accommodations, and apparently, Jake and Emma managed to find perfectly adequate lodging at a bed and breakfast 20 minutes away. My mother mentioned this detail during our next conversation with the particular tone she used when she wanted to make sure I understood the extra trouble my refusal had caused. They had to pay almost $200 a night, and the place was charming but not nearly as convenient as staying at the farmhouse would have been, she said. Emma commented on how lovely it would have been to wake up in the country and have that beautiful view from the guest bedroom windows. I resisted the urge to point out that $200 was probably less than Jake spent on dinner at a nice Seattle restaurant, or that the inconvenience of driving an extra 20 minutes was hardly a major hardship. Instead, I just said, I hoped they'd enjoyed the party and that Rachel was excited about her upcoming wedding. But my mother wasn't finished making her point. You know, Sarah, I've been thinking about this whole situation, and I'm worried that owning that house is changing you in ways that aren't healthy. You used to be such a giving person, always ready to help family when we needed it. Now you seem more concerned with protecting your property than maintaining relationships. There it was, the core accusation that had been building since I'd first established boundaries around my farmhouse. In my mother's view, being a good person meant being available for whatever others needed, whenever they needed it. Having limits, requiring advance notice, expecting reciprocity, these were signs of selfishness rather than self-respect. Mom, I'm still the same person I've always been, I said. The difference is that now I have something worth protecting, and I'm learning to value my own time and space. That doesn't make me selfish. It makes me responsible. But I could tell she wasn't convinced. To her, responsibility meant taking care of other people's needs, not asserting my own. The conversation ended with both of us frustrated and neither of us feeling understood. 2 weeks later, the situation came to a head in a way I hadn't anticipated. Rachel's wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in early October, with gorgeous fall weather and peak foliage creating a perfect backdrop for the ceremony and reception. I'd spent days preparing the property, coordinating with vendors, and making sure every detail was properly managed. The event itself went beautifully, with guests raving about the setting and Rachel glowing with happiness throughout the celebration. But the real drama happened the day after the wedding, when my family arrived for what I thought was going to be a simple cleanup gathering. I'd arranged for the professional cleaning crew to handle the major work, but there were personal items to collect and decorations to pack away. What I expected to be a couple hours of light work turned into something much more significant. My mother arrived first, followed shortly by Jake and Emma, who had decided to extend their trip by a few days after the engagement party. They seemed to be in unusually good spirits, chatting and laughing as they walked around the property, commenting on how beautiful everything looked and how perfect the wedding had been. But there was something in their demeanor that made me pay closer attention. They weren't just helping with cleanup. They were exploring the house and grounds with the kind of detailed interest that people show when they're evaluating real estate. Jake was taking photos of the renovated kitchen and asking specific questions about the appliances and finishes. Emma was measuring windows and discussing how different rooms might be arranged or used. When I asked what they were planning to do with all the photos and measurements, my mother's response caught me completely off guard. Well, honey, we've been talking as a family, and we think it might be time to discuss a more practical arrangement for this property. The phrasing was carefully neutral, but I could sense something important coming. What kind of arrangement? Jake stepped forward with the confident manner he used when he was about to propose a solution that he was sure everyone would find reasonable. Sarah, we all know you've done an amazing job fixing up this place and proving that you can handle property ownership. But let's be realistic about the long-term situation. This house is too big for one person, and you're spending way more on maintenance and improvements than makes financial sense for someone in your position. I felt my stomach tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. What exactly are you suggesting? Emma and I have been talking about moving back to Ohio sooner than we originally planned, he continued. My company has been discussing opening a Midwest office, and this could be perfect timing for me to transfer and help get that operation started. We could take over the farmhouse, handle all the major expenses and maintenance, and you could move back to town where you'd be closer to clients and have a more manageable living situation. The audacity was breathtaking. After dismissing my ability to buy the property, after assuming I'd fail at country living, after requiring me to prove myself over and over again, they were now proposing to take over the house I'd fought to, save and successfully renovated. And they were presenting it as if they'd be doing me a favor. And what would happen to my investment in this property? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. Emma jumped in with the smooth delivery of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. We'd pay you back everything you put into it, of course.